Imagine a supply line that does not crawl across muddy roads or sail through hostile seas, but instead climbs into the roof of the world. Picture young men, barely out of their 20s, guiding heavy transports into storms so fierce they could tear metal apart. Think of valleys hidden in shadow, ridges rising higher than 20,000 feet, and engines gasping for air in the thin sky. This was not a story of tanks or battleships. It was a war fought against mountains, weather, and time itself. During the chaos of the Second World War, America made a decision that stunned even its own generals: to supply China by flying over the Himalayas. What seemed like suicide became a lifeline. What appeared impossible became history. By the late 1930s, the world was already unraveling. Japan had seized Manchuria and by 1937 had launched full-scale war against China. Cities burned, millions fled, and Chinese soldiers fought with dwindling supplies. For America, supporting China was more than strategy. It was a matter of keeping one of the last great Asian nations alive against aggression. At first, help came by sea and through the famous Burma Road, a twisting highway that carried weapons, trucks, and medicine into the heart of China. But in early 1942, when Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia and captured Burma, that artery was cut. Suddenly, China was isolated. Without new supplies, its armies would crumble. The Japanese believed they had closed the circle. In Washington and Chongqing, despair turned into determination. If the land could not be crossed, then the skies must be. The plan was audacious: to fly over the Himalayas, the tallest mountain range on Earth. Mount Everest, Kangchenjunga, endless glaciers and storm belts seemed to make the idea insane. Yet leaders like General Joseph Stilwell knew the choice was stark: either attempt the impossible or watch China collapse. In April 1942, the first transports lifted off from Assam in India. Their holds carried only a few tons of fuel, ammunition, or medicine. The flights were experimental, the maps uncertain, the risk enormous. But when those aircraft landed in Kunming, China, they carried more than cargo. They carried proof that America would not abandon its ally. Each mission was a thread, and together those threads began to weave a lifeline across the sky. This was the birth of the Hump, the Himalayan Airlift. It was not a battle fought with rifles and bayonets, but with courage, engines, and willpower. It would become one of the most dangerous, relentless, and costly undertakings of the entire war. And yet, it would also prove that even nature's highest barriers could not silence the fight for freedom. By the beginning of 1942, the Allied cause in Asia seemed nearly lost. The Japanese Empire had expanded with breathtaking speed, conquering Hong Kong, Malaya, and the Philippines, while forcing the British and their allies into humiliating retreats. The fall of Burma in May of that year dealt a particularly crushing blow. For years, the twisting Burma Road had been the only reliable artery carrying supplies from the outside world into China. When Japanese troops seized Lashio, the last open end of the road, that artery was severed. For Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek, the situation was desperate. His armies, battered and under-equipped, were holding vast stretches of front against the Imperial Japanese Army. Ammunition was short, trucks were broken, and even basic medical supplies were running dry. If China collapsed, Japan would secure full dominance over East Asia, freeing its forces to threaten India, Australia, and beyond. Chiang pressed his American allies for a solution, any solution, to keep his nation alive in the war. In Washington, there was sharp debate. Many officers argued that attempting to resupply China by air was sheer folly. The Himalayas, the tallest mountain range on Earth, stood between India and China like a wall of stone and ice. The idea of crossing it with heavily loaded transport planes seemed suicidal. At the time, America's transport fleet consisted mainly of Douglas C-47s, Skytrains, and the larger but still vulnerable Curtiss C-46 Commandos. These were rugged machines, but they were not designed for altitudes above 20,000 feet, where the thin air robbed engines of power and froze oxygen lines solid. Yet others, led by General Joseph Stilwell, commander of American forces in the China-Burma-India theater, insisted that the attempt must be made. Stilwell was blunt, stubborn, and not easily discouraged. He argued that without a lifeline, China would collapse and Japan's armies would be free to dominate the continent. Better to lose aircraft and men in an attempt than to surrender without trying. The American decision was made in early 1942. Supplies would be flown from airfields in the Indian state of Assam across the Himalayas into Kunming in China's Yunnan province. It was a radical idea, one that required not only courage, but also improvisation on a massive scale. Runways in Assam were little more than dirt strips carved out of jungle and farmland. Crews worked around the clock to lengthen them, often under monsoon rains, while local Indian laborers hauled tons of stone and timber with their bare hands. The first flights began in April 1942. They were tentative, experimental, and carried loads so small they seemed insignificant, sometimes just a few tons of gasoline, crates of ammunition, or sacks of quinine. Pilots had only the crudest maps of the terrain, often nothing more than rough sketches based on British colonial surveys. Navigation was by dead reckoning, following rivers like the Brahmaputra until the mountains rose ahead in dark, forbidding ridges. The dangers were immediate. Engines struggled in the thin air, instruments iced over. A single mistake in heading could send an aircraft into a granite cliff or a glacier. Storms appeared without warning, hurling transports into violent downdrafts that smashed them against unseen peaks. Even when flight succeeded, landing in Kunming was another ordeal. Its runways were short, uneven, and sometimes lit only by torches when night fell. Despite these dangers, the flights carried immense symbolic weight. For Chiang Kai-shek's government, each arrival was a lifeline, proof that America was willing to risk lives and treasure to keep China in the war. For Washington, it was a statement of commitment not only to China but to the larger Allied cause in Asia. At first, the Japanese High Command barely noticed. Confident that their conquest of Burma had isolated China, they dismissed rumors of American planes crossing the Himalayas as exaggeration. But by the summer of 1942, reports filtered in of strange formations of Douglas transports flying high over the mountains, braving weather and altitude in defiance of geography itself. Japanese planners began to realize that their blockade was not as airtight as they had believed. On the ground in India, the logistical effort grew. The United States Army Corps of Engineers expanded bases at Chabua, Dinjan, and Mohanbari, transforming them into hubs of round-the-clock activity. Fuel was shipped by rail from Calcutta to Assam, stacked in endless rows of steel drums. Ammunition, spare parts, radios, even whole aircraft engines arrived by convoy, waiting for transport across the mountains. Indian villagers, many displaced from their homes to make way for airfields, labored as porters, mechanics, and loaders under conditions of exhausting heat and monsoon rains. For the pilots, most of them young men barely out of training, the flights were both terrifying and exhilarating. They nicknamed the route the Hump, because the mountain ridges rose before them like a vast barrier to be climbed. They joked grimly that flying the Hump was like drawing lots with death. Some wrote home describing the breathtaking sight of snow-covered peaks gleaming in moonlight as their transports clawed for altitude. Others confessed in diaries that each takeoff felt like a gamble, with odds stacked against survival. Stillwell himself flew as a passenger on some missions, determined to see firsthand the risks his men faced. His presence inspired some and angered others, for he was a demanding commander, often critical of both his Chinese allies and his own subordinates. But he never doubted the importance of the airlift. In his terse style, he wrote, "Keep them flying. China must be kept alive." As 1942 drew to a close, the operation that had begun as an experiment was becoming permanent. Dozens of transports were now dedicated to the route. Losses were already mounting, but so too was experience. Veteran pilots began to share knowledge of safer passes, of winds to avoid, of valleys that could serve as guides. Each mission added to the unwritten handbook of survival over the Himalayas. The birth of the Hump was therefore not a single dramatic moment, but a gradual accumulation of courage, skill, and sacrifice. From the muddy strips of Assam to the torchlit fields of Kunming, the airlift represented something larger than logistics. It was the defiance of nature itself in the service of freedom. It was proof that even in the darkest days of the war, America and China would not surrender to inevitability. What had begun as a gamble was becoming a lifeline. The Japanese blockade had been pierced, and China, though battered, would fight on. The stage was now set for one of the most dangerous and determined air operations in all of World War II. The early months of the airlift also revealed cultural clashes and misunderstandings between allies. Many American officers were frustrated with what they saw as Chinese inefficiency, while Chinese officials complained that America was not sending nearly enough supplies. Tensions flared during meetings in Chongqing, where Chiang Kai-shek pressed for more planes, more cargo, and more commitment. Washington responded by approving the extension of the Lend-Lease program to China, officially making the Himalayan flights part of a larger Allied logistical network. Trucks, radios, machine tools, and even whole factories were added to the lists of cargo waiting in Assam. On the American home front, newspapers occasionally reported on the daring Sky Road to China, portraying it as a symbol of ingenuity and determination. Families of pilots received letters describing life in the humid valleys of India, where swarms of mosquitoes and the constant roar of engines became part of daily existence. Young men who had grown up on farms in Kansas or towns in Ohio now found themselves flying above the clouds of Tibet, writing in their diaries about the surreal contrast between the simplicity of their old lives and the enormity of the task before them. In Assam itself, the airfields became miniature cities. Barracks and mess halls were thrown up alongside makeshift control towers. Mechanics worked long shifts to keep engines running, often improvising repairs with whatever parts were available. Pilots slept in tents or bamboo huts, waking at odd hours to climb into their cockpits for yet another run across the mountains. Malaria, dysentery, and fatigue took their toll, but morale remained surprisingly resilient. Crews developed a dark humor about their mission, joking that the Himalayas need no anti-aircraft guns, the weather will do the job for them. Each successful landing in Kunming sent ripples through Chinese society. Civilians gathered at airfields to watch the transports touch down, cheering as barrels of gasoline and crates of rifles were unloaded. To them, each plane represented hope, proof that the outside world had not abandoned their struggle. Chinese newspapers printed stories about the American Sky Road, using it as propaganda to strengthen morale among soldiers and civilians alike. The Japanese, meanwhile, were slow to react. Confident in their victory in Burma, they initially believed the airlift to be nothing more than a token gesture. Only later, as more and more reports arrived of American supplies appearing in Chinese hands, did they realize that the Allies had created a lifeline that could not easily be severed. The very audacity of the project, the notion of flying over the tallest mountains on Earth, had made it difficult for Japanese planners to believe such a thing could be sustained. By the end of 1942, the groundwork had been laid. The India-China Ferry Command, which had overseen the first tentative flights, evolved into the Air Transport Command, a permanent organization with the mission of sustaining the Himalayan bridge. What had started with a handful of planes was already expanding into a fleet, and what had seemed suicidal was now routine. The birth of the Hump, then, was not simply about cargo tonnage or tactical necessity. It was about resilience in the face of despair. It was about America and China standing together against both enemy pressure and the merciless geography of the Earth. The decision to fly the Hump transformed the very meaning of supply and warfare. It demonstrated that in the vast global conflict of World War II, even mountains could be conquered when survival demanded it. Flying the Hump soon became one of the most perilous undertakings of the entire Second World War. The Himalayas were not simply mountains, they were a fortress of nature, a wall of ice and rock that rose higher than any aircraft of the early 1940s was ever designed to climb. Peaks soared above 20,000 feet, their slopes wrapped in glaciers, their ridges hidden beneath clouds that shifted with terrifying speed. For the pilots, the challenges began the moment their wheels left the runways of Assam. Engines strained in the humid heat of India, then sputtered as the air thinned with altitude. Oxygen systems often froze during the climb, leaving crews gasping for breath, flirting with blackouts. Ice formed on wings, forcing aircraft into dangerous stalls. Inside the cockpits, men bundled in heavy jackets fought against frost that crept across windows, blinding them at the very moment they needed visibility most. The weather was as deadly as any enemy. From May to September, the monsoon drenched northern India and Burma, unleashing walls of rain that swallowed aircraft whole. Downdrafts lurked in hidden valleys, slamming transports downward with a violence that ripped wings from their roots. Thunderheads rose like mountains themselves, towering higher than flight ceilings. In winter, the skies froze solid. Winds screamed across the ridges with such ferocity that they could tear metal apart. Many crews described the terror of being caught in turbulence so severe that aircraft shook like leaves, rivets snapping one by one. Navigation was little better than guesswork. Maps of the Himalayas were crude sketches, often decades out of date. Compasses failed amid the region's mineral deposits. Instead, pilots followed rivers like the Brahmaputra or the Salween, hoping they would lead them in the right direction. A mistake of only a few miles could doom a flight, sending it into a canyon from which there was no escape. The losses mounted quickly. By the end of the war, more than 700 transport aircraft had vanished into the mountains, their wreckage scattered across glaciers and valleys. More than 1,000 American and Allied airmen perished. The trails of shattered aluminum that dotted the Himalayas became known grimly as the Aluminum Trail. Decades later, villagers in Tibet and Assam would still stumble upon fragments of fuselages, propellers twisted like toys, and faded parachutes half buried in snow. To those who flew the missions, survival felt like chance. Veterans recalled seeing comrades vanish into clouds, never to emerge again. Some flights disappeared without a trace, leaving only silence on the radios. Families back home received terse telegrams, missing in action, presumed lost. For the crews, the grim joke was that the Himalayas needed no anti-aircraft guns. The mountains and storms were more lethal than any Japanese fighter. And yet, the Japanese did try. From airfields in northern Burma, they launched patrols of Nakajima-Ki, 43 Oscar fighters and Mitsubishi bombers, ordered to intercept Allied transports. But geography worked against them. The transports often flew at altitudes close to 20,000 feet at the edge of Japanese aircraft performance. Clouds and storms hid them. Even when enemy fighters found their targets, the slow but sturdy American transports proved surprisingly resilient. Crews sometimes pushed their planes higher into thin air where Japanese engines faltered. In the deadly game of survival, nature proved both adversary and ally. The Americans adapted quickly. After suffering losses to enemy raids in Assam, they expanded defensive perimeters around the airfields, installed anti-aircraft guns, and dispersed aircraft across multiple bases. Pilots learned to vary their routes, sometimes pushing north toward Tibet, other times dipping south along less monitored passes. This unpredictability frustrated Japanese attempts at interception. Engineers experimented with new navigation aids, primitive radio beacons, radar equipment, and improved oxygen systems, but much of survival still came down to experience and instinct. Among the pilots, a culture of fraternity emerged, bound together by the shared knowledge that every flight could be their last. They gave the mountain passes names like Hell's Pass and Black Cat Gap, trading stories of those who had vanished there. Letters home spoke of breathtaking views, the peaks of Everest and Kangchenjunga glowing in moonlight, set against the ever-present fear of crashing into them. For many, each mission was a test of endurance, courage, and sheer luck. The dangers on the ground were no less severe. In Assam, airfields turned to mud under monsoon rains. Mechanics worked knee-deep in water, swatting mosquitoes as they stripped engines. Supply clerks hauled barrels of fuel under sweltering sun, the air buzzing with insects and the ever-present threat of malaria or dysentery. Medical units struggled to keep pace with disease, often lacking enough quinine or penicillin. Many men who survived the skies found themselves laid low by illness on the ground. Despite all this, morale endured. Pilots and crews believed their mission mattered. Every barrel of gasoline delivered meant Chinese fighters could rise to challenge Japanese bombers. Every crate of ammunition unloaded in Kunming meant soldiers on the front could hold their lines a little longer. Some spoke of the pride they felt, knowing that their flights were keeping a nation alive. The sense of purpose, fragile yet powerful, carried them through the losses. Stories of heroism circulated among the men. One pilot, realizing his aircraft would not clear a ridge, ordered his crew to bail out while he held the controls long enough to give them a chance. He perished, but his sacrifice saved 3 others. Another crew, their plane struck by Japanese fire, managed to limp back to Assam on a single engine, landing with their cargo intact. Rescue missions were rare. Terrain and weather made them nearly impossible. But when stranded crews were found, it was often by Tibetan villagers or Chinese farmers who guided them to safety across mountains and rivers. These bonds, forged in moments of desperation, left lifelong memories. The cumulative cost was staggering. By the time the war ended, more than 1,000 Allied airmen had died flying the Hump. Their names were inscribed on memorials in Assam and Yunnan, reminders of the invisible battlefield in the sky. For locals, the wreckage left behind became part of the landscape. Children in remote villages played with shards of aluminum. Farmers unearthed twisted engines while tilling their fields. Even decades later, hikers would stumble upon the remains of C-47s and C-46s, silent witnesses to the sacrifices made in the war. Yet through it all, the missions never ceased. Day and night, in sun and storm, the transports climbed into the sky, defying the odds again and again. The airlift was a paradox, a routine of constant danger, a daily gamble with death that became ordinary. Crews joked bitterly, but they also believed deeply. As one veteran later said, "We were not heroes, we were just men doing our job." But that job was to keep China alive, and that was worth the risk. The Himalayas claimed hundreds of planes and thousands of lives, but they could not break the will of those who flew over them. In their determination, in their courage, and in their sacrifice, the pilots and crews of the Hump embodied a truth of the Second World War, that sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with bullets, but with endurance against impossible odds. Life on the airfields of Assam revealed a unique mixture of cultures and hardships. American pilots lived side by side with British officers, Indian laborers, and Chinese mechanics. Communication was often clumsy, but the shared danger of the mission built quiet respect. Indian workers, many recruited from poor villages, carried heavy barrels of gasoline and ammunition across mud-soaked fields. Chinese crews, though short of equipment, worked tirelessly to repair aircraft at Kunming, often under the shadow of Japanese air raids. For the young American airmen, most barely 20 years old, the psychological strain was immense. Each flight meant staring death in the face. Before takeoff, men would sit silently in mess halls, writing hurried letters home, slipping them into pockets in case they never returned. After landing, those who survived gathered in small groups, sometimes too exhausted to speak, sometimes sharing nervous laughter that masked relief. A sense of fatalism spread among crews. They believed their lives were measured not in months or years, but in the number of flights they had yet to survive. The year 1943 proved especially costly. Storms were relentless, maps still inadequate, and Japanese patrols more aggressive. Entire squadrons were sometimes lost in a single week. One report described a flight of 4 transports leaving Assam. Only 2 arrived in Kunming. The others simply vanished into the clouds. Commanders tried to improve safety with better training, new instruments, and more reliable aircraft like the C-54 Skymaster, but the dangers remained. Yet even in the face of such loss, the mission endured. Pilots developed rituals before flights. Some carried lucky charms, others whispered prayers. Crews created traditions, like painting symbols on fuselages for every successful crossing. These gestures, small as they were, helped men feel they had some control over their fate. The bond among them grew unbreakable. To fly the Hump was to belong to a fraternity of survival, a brotherhood forged not by choice but by necessity. The Japanese command watched with increasing frustration. They had believed that cutting the Burma Road would strangle China into submission. Instead, they saw supplies continuing to flow by air, a trickle at first but growing each month. Their efforts to intercept the transports drained fuel and aircraft, often with little result. Worse, the persistence of the flight signaled to China and the world that Japan's strategy of isolation had failed. The Sky Road was humiliating proof that even the Himalayas could not stop American determination. By the time Allied memorials were erected years later in Assam and Yunnan, they bore hundreds upon hundreds of names: pilots, navigators, radio operators, mechanics, men who had paid with their lives for every ton of cargo that reached China. Survivors often carried scars, both physical and emotional. Many spoke decades later of waking at night, hearing the phantom roar of engines, or dreaming of mountains looming out of darkness. Yet, despite the fear, despite the sacrifice, the missions became routine in their persistence. Planes kept lifting off day after day, night after night. Each flight was an act of defiance against nature, against despair, and against the belief that China could not be saved. The danger was constant, the cost was high, but the will to endure proved stronger still. The Himalayan Airlift was not only a logistical achievement, it was a crucible of endurance. For every pilot who disappeared into cloud and silence, another stepped forward to take his place. For every plane lost, another arrived from American factories. Together, they turned a suicide mission into a lifeline, and in doing so, they changed the course of the war. By 1943, the Himalayan Airlift had grown from a desperate gamble into a massive logistical enterprise. What began with small loads of gasoline and ammunition soon expanded into a full-scale lifeline that sustained China's war effort. The numbers told the story. A few hundred tons delivered in early 1942 became over 10,000 tons per month by the end of 1943. By mid-1944, deliveries surpassed 20,000 tons monthly, and in the summer of 1945, more than 70,000 tons were flown in a single month. The expansion was possible because of enormous Allied investment. In Assam, runways at Chabwa, Dinjan, and Mohanbari were lengthened and reinforced to handle larger Douglas C-54 Skymasters. Engineers, American and Indian alike, labored through monsoons to build depots and hangars. Millions of gallons of aviation fuel were shipped across the Indian Ocean, unloaded at Calcutta, and hauled by rail to staging areas. On the Chinese side, airfields at Kunming were extended by civilian laborers, often under Japanese air raids. Cargo varied widely. Fuel was the lifeblood, keeping Chinese and American squadrons flying. Rifles, artillery shells, and radios gave Chinese divisions the means to hold their lines. Spare aircraft engines, medical supplies, food rations, even dismantled fighter planes were squeezed into transports. Every pound mattered. The impact was profound. Chinese armies, once on the brink of collapse, continued to resist Japanese offensives. At battles like Changsha and Hengyang in 1944, American-supplied ammunition enabled Chinese soldiers to hold against overwhelming assaults. The 14th Air Force, commanded by General Claire Chennault, relied entirely on Hump deliveries to maintain operations. His squadrons, including the famed Flying Tigers, struck Japanese bridges, railways, and supply lines, forcing Japan to commit more troops and aircraft than they had planned. The Hump also paved the way for a new strategic weapon. In late 1944, B-29 Superfortress bombers flew from Chinese bases to strike Japan itself under Operation Matterhorn. Though the effort was limited by the staggering logistics, each bomb dropped required multiple flights of supplies over the Himalayas. It was a psychological shock to Tokyo. The very existence of such missions proved that Japan could not hide behind distance. For Japan, the airlift was a nightmare. Their plan to strangle China by seizing Burma had failed. Attempts to intercept transports from bases in northern Burma were frustrated by altitude, storms, and the flexibility of American logistics. Every transport lost seemed quickly replaced by new ones arriving from American factories. Strategically, the Hump forced Japan to keep hundreds of thousands of soldiers pinned in China, unable to reinforce the Pacific Islands. The psychological effect was just as important as the material. Chinese civilians, weary from years of occupation and shortages, saw American planes as symbols of solidarity. Propaganda posters celebrated the bravery of Allied pilots. For Washington, the tonnage figures became proof of industrial might and moral resolve, demonstrating to Congress and the public that the United States could sustain allies even across the world's highest mountains. By war's end, over 650,000 tons of cargo had crossed the Hump. More than 1,000 aircraft and over 1,000 airmen were lost, but the mission succeeded. It kept China alive in World War II, tied down Japanese divisions, and gave the Allies a base to strike deeper into Asia. Perhaps most importantly, it showed that air transport could sustain entire theaters of war, a lesson that reshaped global aviation in the post-war world. The Hump was not merely a logistical operation, it was proof that determination, industry, and courage could overcome even the Himalayas. In the words of one American officer, "The mountains were high, but our resolve was higher." The Himalayan Airlift remains one of the most daring achievements of World War II. Against storms, mountains, and staggering loss, American and Allied crews kept China alive in the fight. More than 650,000 tons of supplies crossed the world's highest barrier at the cost of over 1,000 lives. Yet their sacrifice proved that no blockade, no geography, and no despair could silence the struggle for freedom. The Hump was more than a supply route. It was a symbol of endurance, a reminder that even in World War II, courage could carve a highway through the sky.